also muted.
Yeah.
That's better, yeah.
this take so long to set up? It doesn't actually be live on there.
No.
It is only sort of.
As the world leader for peace and cybersecurity, the President of Finland, Sauli Niinisto. President Niinisto has had the honor and privilege of holding nearly every high office in Finland. He's been the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Finance, Deputy Prime Minister, Speaker of the Parliament, and since 2012, the President of Finland. Earlier this year, he won a second term as president, prevailing by the largest margin of any presidential candidate in the nation's history. He's been a leading voice for European peace and unity and has taken a particularly strong stance on Russia's takeover of the Crimea and presence in eastern Ukraine. He's also been quite critical of other countries that have been violating international law and doing things that are dangerous and unwise and illegal in Europe. And despite the risk of Finland's traditional economic and diplomatic relationship with Russia and others, he's been outspoken on these kinds of issues. He has said, and I quote, "We condemn any illegal occupation, illegal use of force, or attempts to limit the sovereignty of independent nations. Such actions never achieve anything but danger and increased tension." Yet at the same time, he has worked very hard to ease tensions and develop understanding between Russia and Europe. He's also been a strong advocate for cybersecurity. During his term, Finland has developed one of the most comprehensive cybersecurity strategies in the world, one that cuts across all sectors of society and the economy. It includes substantial investments in cyber research and development, and the stated goal of the strategy is to make Finland one of the world's leading authorities on and contributors to cybersecurity. So it's a pleasure to honor him today, and I think, Tuan, we have a message from him.
Mr. Dukakis, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to receive this award and to greet you with this message. We live in a time of rapid technological change. Our societies are getting more and more digital. While this development clearly benefits us in a number of ways, it also makes us more vulnerable to accidental incidents as well as to malicious behavior by others. Different kinds of cyber threats now challenge us all over the world. Countering them begins at home. To increase their national cyber security, all nations need to do their utmost to increase awareness among their citizens and to build resilience in all sectors of society. Yet, cyber threats are a prime example of a 21st century challenge. They don't respect national borders. Nobody can tackle them on their own. In cyberspace, too, we need to strengthen international cooperation and rules-based international order. Finland continues to stress the importance of a single, open, free, stable, and peaceful cyberspace. Responsible state behavior is needed. International law and the UN Charter apply in the digital world just as they do in the physical world. As an example of international cooperation in this field, we are delighted to have established the European Centre of Excellence for countering hybrid threats in Helsinki. It is a joint effort of the EU and NATO aiming to make our societies more secure. To conclude, I would like to highlight one specific aspect, the role of girls and women. Unlocking their full potential is crucial for our success as an international community, also in the cyber domain. We should educate and advocate more girls and women to become active in this field. It will make us better prepared to profit from the immense opportunities the digital era is providing us. I wish you a fruitful and thought-provoking event. Once again, thank you.
Good thoughts and a lot of wisdom. Now we have a short message, and we've been pleased in these meetings to have lots of representation from Japan and from Japan's leaders. And we have a brief talk by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan, Taro Kono.
Good morning. This is Taro Kono, Foreign Minister of Japan. I would like to congratulate the success of Boston Global Forum during the Global Cybersecurity Day Symposium. Today, innovative technologies such as AI, big data, and IoT are becoming more significant in society and bringing about progress in the unification of cyberspace and real space. While these technologies can bring many benefits to people, there is the latent risk of causing an immeasurable economic and social loss when they are used for malicious purpose. Against this backdrop, Japan is vigorously moving forward with our cyber diplomacy to realize free, fair, and secure cyberspace. It consists of 3 pillars: promotion of the rule of law in cyberspace, development of confidence-building measures, and cooperation on capacity building. To promote this cyber diplomacy, a close public-private cooperation is essential. In this regard, I believe that discussion in this symposium, with the participation of prominent members from all over the world, will greatly contribute to the promotion of free, fair, and secure cyberspace. I sincerely hope that discussions here will provide valuable insights and guidance for our common future with innovative technologies. Thank you very much.
Now I think we have some remarks from the former Japanese ambassador to the United States, Shiro Ichizaki. Also on film.
Yes.
Do you hear me? Following Minister Kono, I just wanted to say that we are now working on the security cyber strategy, and just adopted in this July the second cybersecurity strategy after 3 years. The first one was in 2015. I think the one focus we'll have is 2020 Olympic Games, because as we have seen in London and Rio de Janeiro, you had to go through a lot of cyber attacks. Two things I'll just say is that, one, we have a public transportation system which is very good, but could be vulnerable as well, because 80% of commuters coming into Tokyo City is using public transportation like trains and bus and all that. It's not like any other cities in the world, big cities. That's one. Point two, our cashless society level is only 20%. 10 years ago, that was 8%. But the government is now trying to make it to 40%, which is closer to the United States by 2020. So this card system will be could be a target as well. We have countries surrounding us who have some rumors about choosing these strategies. So we have to be very careful, and government is putting a lot of effort. And now I would like to pass this on to Minister Nakasone. Sorry, Minister Nakayama.
Hello, good morning. This is Yasuhide Nakayama. I'm a former state minister for foreign affairs. And now I'm in charge of counterterrorism, especially on on security issues. And this is the end of the year right now. And we have to focus on the future and what the next attack kind of image of the trend of the terrorist who is going to use cyber attacks and their cyber technology. In Japan, we arrest one boy, 16 years old boy, and he was playing the internet game, online game. And he couldn't win one lady who made a real good character on the game. So he steal her account and password, and he actually attacked, and he changed her security code and the passwords. So that's why he arrested. It's this summer. And what we can learn from this case is the gamers, online gamers, is going to become a terrorist for next decade. Maybe the next year, we have to focusing on the online gamers, and we have to care, and we have to search really precisely those players on the net games. And also, we are focusing on the Russians Apophis code groups, and they are always try to do DDoS attacks to the every single transportation servers, or the ticketing for the Olympic Games, or those like a very big event. Even the poker game people, I mean the organizers, because they handle the money, and they actually tweet it when they attack, because they have to prove that they did it. So we are focusing on those the Russian hackers, and also we have to care about the telegrams. You know, even the SFB of the Moscow, they already made to stop all the activities of telegrams in Russia. But in Japan, because of the bitcoins and also the, how you say, 仮想通貨って何でしたっけ? Imagination coins, virtual cryptocurrency. Sorry? Cryptocurrency. Because of the cryptocurrency issue, lots of Japanese people now accessing and using the Russian telegrams. And actually, the user of the telegrams are IS, Daesh, those terrorists, really using the those technologies. So this means 3 years ago, IS is very active on the cyberspace. But next year is they show up again on the cyberspace, especially for Eastern Asia, which is our neighbors. I mean, including Japan, of course. And we are going to have a very big events. Next year, we are going to have a Rugby World Cup. And also, we are going to have Olympic Games and Paralympics Games 2020. And also, World Masters Game on 2021. And then we are going to have an Expo 2025. So we need lots of cooperation between the cyber, on the cyberspace, during, including you and every single country who are really try to stop those terrorist activities on the cybernet. So, and thank you very much for listening my comment. In my country, this is 23:11 right now, and now I'm going to drink. Did you understand my English?
Very good. Perfect.
Perfect? Thank you.
We had hoped to have Liam Byrne with us today, live, right here in Cambridge. And he was not a stranger to these, to Cambridge and Glasgow. But something called Brexit has kind of come up in British politics. So he's got to stay home because he is not only a member of Parliament, but he's the shadow minister for digital, which is kind of interesting. The UK has a ministry for digital affairs. And so he's going to be with us, fortunately, live. But we hope that the UK can resolve these issues. It's not going to be easy. And in any event, Liam, thank you for being with us. And
London calling.
Part of this effort. You're on.
Governor, thanks so much for inviting me to participate today. I'm so sad that I can't be back in Harvard today. This is supposed to be the week where we had the crunch vote on Brexit. That vote was pulled last night, and as some of you may have seen in the news already today, this morning the Prime Minister has been challenged in a motion of no confidence by her own party. There may be, over the next 24 hours, a motion of no confidence in the government. So unfortunately, everyone who is a member of our Parliament is kind of locked into this gilded cage until we know what the outcome is of some of our debates over the next 2 to 3 days. So believe me, I'm there with you in spirit.
We will present by video. So after that time, my Dukakis will follow it. He will video.
Maybe waiting for a question.
Governor Dukakis, Mr. President, Minister Taro Kono, thank you so much for the honour of speaking with you today. and let me apologise at once for speaking with you virtually. Believe me when I say I am there with you in spirit. Given the turmoil of our capital today, I am yearning for the calm of your campus. It's a campus that I remember with tremendous love. I was newly married to Sarah, and around our little nest on Cambridge Street, the dot-com revolution appeared to be changing the very laws of economics, the rules of business, the very codes and norms of society. But revolutions are rarely predictable, and we did not predict the profound change in the balance of power between nation and nation, and of course between rich and poor. 30 years ago, I remember standing in the pouring rain in a Harvard car park, pleading with a professor to let me into a course on how you build information age business. Today, as a politician, I'm talking to you about how we tame that business power. As a student, it felt like we were living in an era of change. As a politician, it feels like we're living in a change of era. What our powers of prophecy failed to forecast was the effect of a three-way merger. The merger between the great information age, the merger between the age of American hyperpower, and of course, the legacy of 30 years of liberal economics. Those changes have combined to now provoke some significant challenges for this new era. And that challenge was spelled out for me best by a very senior Financial Times economist here in London. The challenge of this new era, he said, is whether the world is going to become more Hobbesian or more Rawlsian. Are we going to find a way, following John Rawls, of finding new ways to spread the benefits and spread the burdens of new possibilities? Or are we looking at a Hobbesian world, a nightmare of all against all? Speaking to a Harvard audience, I thought I'd better explain why it is that I think John Rawls can win the day. Let me explain the challenges before I offer a few answers. After victory in the Cold War, we were left with America and its allies in NATO as the world's only hyperpower. But this age of asymmetry was always going to provoke an insurgency, and so it proved. From Al-Qaeda to active measures, malign actors have sought to use technology to radicalize, to terrorize, and to paralyze, exploiting the online world to slow discourse, to inflame two sides of any argument, in short, to divide and to rule. But the second challenge is not foreign, it's actually domestic. Technology, plus the free markets that we created in the 1980s, have spawned what we now see today, the supergiants of the global economy. These companies are so big that they're able to bend market outcomes and bend them towards inequality. That inequality is the rocket fuel of populism, the very populism that our enemies seek to inflame. It was Joseph Schumpeter, another Harvard thinker, who predicted this. Everyone remembers his famous axiom that capitalism is driven by creative destruction. But everyone forgets the corollary, which is the destruction of competition. And that is what we now face today. The rise of what I'd call technopolies can be seen across the digital economy. These are superstar firms, which economists like David Alter and others have explained drive down labour's share of market income. So if we put together this age of insurgency and this age of technopoly, we do indeed have the makings of a Hobbesian world. I don't think that this status quo can last for very long. It is simply too unstable. This House of Commons today feels unstable. But nor do we want, even if we could have it, a Chinese approach of much stronger central state control. What we have to do is we have to find a middle way through this. And I think it's John Rawls who should be our guide. Rawls had a brilliant idea, the idea of the overlapping consensus, to describe the way that we construct the law of peoples and crystallize the rights which are equal to each. It is this overlapping consensus that I think that we need today. It's a new consensus that we should enshrine in rights for the digital age. A bill, if you like, of digital rights, perhaps a 34th Amendment to your constitution, or here, a new convention for our Council of Europe. Now, the content of this Novus Charter should reflect the different roles that all of us take on in life. The role of a citizen, the role of a worker, the role of a consumer, the role of a parent, and yes, our life as a child. Let me start with our basic rights as citizens, because it is perhaps here that we face the most dangerous of paradoxes. The social networks that were built to nurture sweet talk have now become echo chambers of hate speech. As humans, we love to connect, but we fear to be different. So those who want to play the part of a digital Mephistopheles and entice us into supporting an agenda not of building bridges, but walls, well, they don't have to work very hard. And countries like Russia know this. Their dark social playbook, a playbook that connects hackers, fake news sites, troll farms, and dark money, pumping ads around Facebook groups, targeted with psychographic precision, thanks to firms like Cambridge Analytica, take apart old defences of democracy for the very simple reason that our laws are out of date. So we should update those laws. Here in the UK, we're looking very hard at ideas like the Feinstein Bill, which would require social networks to report glorification or act preparatory to acts of terrorism. We're looking hard at Germany's NetzDG law, which has worked so well in taking down hate speech in Germany. We're looking hard at proposals from Senator Warner to propose a duty on platforms to clearly and conspicuously label bots to protect consumers and to stop bots amplifying disinformation. Plus, a duty to determine the origin of posts and accounts, an absolutely crucial step that bad actors are not allowed to abuse free speech in the arena of our democracy. As citizens, we bear the right to be fully informed, and that needs enshrining for the digital age. Second, as workers, I think we face both one of the biggest opportunities and the biggest threats in living memory. Automation could affect something like 1.2 billion of the world's 3.5 billion workers. And it would be naive of us to think that that change is not going to be disruptive. It's the challenge which I called the Harry Bridges test. The legendary president of the American Dockers Union, he earned his spurs during the difficult and sometimes brutal 1934 strike. But it was the mechanization of the 1960s that really provoked him to ask what I think is the essential question. How do we win for our members a piece of the machine? The challenge, said Bridges, was how we get machines working for the workers rather than against them. And that is the challenge that we have today. Without rights to a genuine minimum living wage, without a right to retraining, without a right to algorithmic justice to stop the automation of discrimination in hiring and firing and managing in the workplace, we are never going to create the project hope that we need for the future of automation. Third, in the marketplace for consumers, we have got to act now to protect the freedom of choice by protecting the reality of competition. In many parts of our economy, but in particular in the digital world, that notion of competition is moving, quite frankly, from theory to fantasy. The founding father of economics, Adam Smith, who hailed from not far from here, had a lot to say about the dangers of monopoly. This is what he wrote. People of the same trade, he said, seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. Well, this summer, it was the IMF which revealed just how stark that contrivance has now become. When they looked at the markups in prices across advanced economies since the 1980s, they found an incredible 40+% increase. That reflects the diminishing quality of competition across the advanced West. It is a sign that competitive forces are now waning. And I don't think that that should necessarily surprise us. At the Harvard Business School, just down the road from you, I wasn't trained to protect competition. I was trained to destroy it. That is how we reward our corporate chieftains today. Well, I remember Michael Porter teaching me the essence of strategy formulation is coping with competition. Well, now technology is being used to systematically destroy competition. The world's 2,500 companies, the largest firms on earth, now account for 90% of global research and development. The top 500 firms control an incredible 82% of that total. They're using that spend to undercut competition and build data monopolies that lock in their customers for the future. Yet, today's competition rules don't touch this. Facebook, for example, bought 69 companies since 2007. When they bought WhatsApp in a deal worth $13 billion, the turnover thresholds weren't big enough to trigger merger control. Yet Facebook acquired control of 1 billion WhatsApp accounts to add to its data pile. The risk of data monopolies is now serious, and the competition rules need updating to protect our rights as consumers in this digital age. The fourth set of rights are our rights as parents. As parents, we have rights to honour because we have duties to honour, duties to our children. That means that we have duties to safeguard our children's welfare, where they now spend so much time online. This is not a marginal issue. About a third of online users are now children. And I think it is fair to say that the founders of America did not intend the rights of free speech to act to undermine the healthy instruction of our children. Now, legislating in this area is quite rightly very difficult, but if we owe a duty of care to our children, then surely companies owe a duty of care to our children too. If I went out today and built a physical arena somewhere in London and filled it up with lots of people, then quite rightly, I would be asked to follow all kinds of safety procedures. And yet, if I build an online arena and fill it with people, I'm under no such obligations. What this now means is that in virtual arenas, we see the growth of new and dangerous harms. For example, the suicide games, which we have seen spreading around social media platforms like the Blue Whale Challenge. It's a dangerous game. It goads children into challenges, and they might start off as innocuous, but they steadily escalate into acts of self-harm. Despite Instagram's awareness of that challenge, shared across its platforms, this game has been linked to over 100 teenage deaths in Russia, and the game has spread to the United Kingdom and indeed to India. I think it is time that we impose the same duties of care on social media firms by asking them to set out the harms which they know they are at risk of creating, and inspecting them on taking appropriate steps to combat those harms. We should insist too that the rights of children do not stop at their screens. The rights of children have digital dimensions too, the right to informed use, the right to be safe, and crucially, and this will be one of the biggest debates for the future, the right to universal digital literacy. Finally, as we know, rights always have to be matched by responsibilities. Changes in technology will bring changes in the responsibilities for many. And that has always been the way. When Michael Faraday, the great British scientist, was trying to explain electricity to William Gladstone, it's fair to say it wasn't a happy conversation. Gladstone was struggling to make sense of this extraordinary new phenomenon that Faraday was trying to explain. But, he said, after all, what is the use of it? Said Gladstone to the exasperated scientist. And pausing for thought, Faraday said, well, sir, there is every possibility that you will soon be able to tax it. Technology giants today like to move fast and break things, but someone has to put back together society. That isn't free, it's expensive, and that is why we need social media and technology firms to step up to their responsibilities to pay their taxes. Governor, I want to conclude by acknowledging that many of the changes that I propose here will provoke cries of rage, not least cries of anguish in parts of Silicon Valley. But rights, as Madison knew, are never immutable. They must evolve and they must change as a society makes progress. Madison noted in the Federalist Papers that some rights result from the nature of our life together, the compact that we have for living together. Trial by jury, for example, was never a natural right, but a right that resulted from a social compact which regulates the action of the community, as essential to secure the liberty of the people as any one of the pre-existing rights of nature. Of all the lessons that I learned at Harvard, perhaps the most important was the lesson of the power of enterprise to change the world for good. In my own study of the change makers in British history, what I found is that entrepreneurs make history by inventing the future. But if we want that future to be a place of hope and of opportunity for all, then we have to remember that the task of politicians is to shape the market to the society we want, not let the market dictate the society that we have. That is why lawmakers and change makers today must now join forces to reshape those wise constraints that make us free. And I hope John Rawls would approve. Thank you very much.
Now, I assume Liam is with us electronically, right?
Yes, now Q&A.
I am.
Right.
I hope you can hear me.
Let me begin by saying that you ought to publish about 1 million of those, your copies of your speech, and distribute. I'm serious. I'm very serious. I thought that was one of the most thoughtful talks I've heard in a long, long time.
You're very kind.
I hope we can help to support what you're saying and others and follow your advice, because as you pointed out, it's not too soon to do that. I mean, this is a serious set of problems, and we ought to be taken them very seriously. I've got a room full of wise and thoughtful people here, and I hope you all have comments, thoughts, suggestions, questions of our guest from afar, even as he and his colleagues struggled with a few difficult political problems these days in the UK. Who's first? Nasli, what do you think?
I think this is an amazing presentation or lecture or whatever. You put together a set of issues that we usually discuss very separately, and you've given us a coherent structure within which to frame our reactions and frame our responses. The one question I had is this: the regulatory mechanisms, the legal systems, etc., are slow in adjusting, adapting changes. We want them to be robust and slow. So I'd like your thoughts about how do we manage the slowness of our institutional infrastructures in this domain with the speed with which we need to respond?
So this is a great question. I think there are basically 3 things that we're going to have to try and do. So first, the truth is that domestic legislation in each of our countries is going to have to be modernized. So what the Cambridge Analytica scandal exposed in the UK is that we have laws which are hopelessly out of date. So we don't regulate video on Facebook, for example. Yeah, that's where a lot of election attack ads are placed. So every country is going to have to find its own way to modernize its domestic laws. I guess my appeal is that good people work together internationally to try and create a framework, a global agenda for a Bill of Digital Rights within which we each work. Because I think one of the great things about this conference is that you're really exposing how the challenges in Japan are exactly the same in many ways as the challenges that we face here in the United Kingdom. So first, update domestic laws. Second, work harder to try and fit that change, that reform, into a framework of a global agenda. Third, there will be international set pieces that we need to try and reform too. And I mean, the most obvious is the Geneva Convention. So at the moment, we don't really have a Geneva Convention that regulates cyber conflict, for example. We do have some settings in which we can work that stuff through. So in Europe, we have the Council of Europe. We'll remain a member of the Council of Europe even after we leave the European Union. And that gives us a good chance, I think, to start working some of this through internationally. Now, you know, I tried to be provocative in the speech and suggest that, you know, the US Constitution it's not permanent. The US Constitution is going to need to evolve in this century. I mean, if you think about hot topics in the US, like the debate around the Second Amendment, you can't shoot a bot. I mean, you're going to need different kinds of defenses for the cyber age in the US too. And so that's why I suggested this, you know, provocative idea of a 34th Amendment. In Europe, we'll need something like a new convention of the Council of Europe. So there will be international agreements that we need to get on with, and they will take, you know, almost certainly 5 to 10 years to work through. And so that's our kind of third track, if you like. But look, you know, the sooner we start, the sooner we finish. So let's get on with it.
So thank you again for your excellent comments. As you think about the distribution of benefit from technology, tech companies are wired to think about speed of innovation as well as the economic benefit. And so how do you change the mental wiring of tech companies to incorporate these kind of social benefits that you're describing? Because even though tech companies talk about this and give lip service to it, that's not how their DNA is structured.
So this is a brilliant question. I'm going to introduce a prop at this stage, which is when I did my MBA at Harvard, the way they taught me economic history was through a biography of American capitalists, and we didn't have a book like that in Britain, so I had to write one, which came out a year or two ago, and it's really interesting because what it shows is that the great entrepreneurs through our history, and this is true of America as well, by the way, the great entrepreneurs don't just try and change the rules of business; they try and change the world, and so alongside the kind of creative destruction of the marketplace comes the creative reconstruction of society. So particularly in that era, before shareholder capital became so dominant, we had the most extraordinary century of capitalists who tried to, in this country, for example, build different kinds of towns. They tried to create different kinds of living. We had great pioneers like George Cadbury, or the founder of Unilever, or John Lewis, who actually tried to create different ways of living. And I think this is quite a potent message for a lot of our most successful entrepreneurs today. Don't just focus on wealth, focus on changing the world for the better. Now, alongside that, we've got to be realistic and recognize that laws change as economics and business change too. And I say this to our tech firms in London a lot. In the 19th century, we didn't have one Factory Act. We had 17 Factory Acts over the course of the 19th century. We updated the legislation as technology and the factory system and communities changed. We're going to have a similar pace of regulatory change in the tech world now. In order to make that change predictable as possible, that's good for business, let's set out some first principles. So that's why we tried to write here at the beginning of the year the first Bill of Digital Rights, and it was easier than we thought. I mean, we can publish it and send it over. If I was with you, if I was with you this week in the States, I would be trying to begin building the consensus around this Bill of Digital Rights. We've started doing that work in Europe already. let's set out some first principles. Things like the right to algorithmic justice, the right to be fully informed, the right to universal digital literacy. It's actually quite easy to get to about 12 to 14 different articles of statements of first principle, which should then guide the subsequent regulation over the course of the next century. So 19th century history is a really good guide to how we've cracked some of these problems before. There's nothing new on earth. So let's try and win some hearts and minds amongst entrepreneurs. Let's try and persuade them to do some good for society, not just make some fortunes. But I think as legislators, as policymakers, let's start thinking what are the first principles against which we regulate over the course of this extraordinary century that's about to unfold.
We have a couple of questions from me. First, are you in touch with any American legislators at this point on this?
So Governor, we were hoping to see Senator Warner on Monday. We were hoping to see the team around Senator Warren. And you know, the reason that we think it is important to touch base soon is that obviously there are some new forces now at work in your Congress. The House Intelligence Committee will have changed control, I believe. And you know, we are also interested in conversations in with the Federal Trade Commission, because this issue of competition policy is super important. When we talk to our competition authorities here, what they basically say is there are only a couple of centers in the world at the moment that are really getting their heads around the challenge. One is actually the team around the Federal Trade Commission. The other is actually the German cartel office based in Berlin, as well as some of the teams in London. So it's quite a small community of politicians that are really focused on this. And so we are, we're just kind of desperate for your advice on who best to connect to on that side of the Atlantic.
And you mentioned the Council of Europe. Is the UN into this at all at this point?
I mean, the UN, I think, has done some good stuff around regulation of the internet, but it's just not having to confront the sharpness of problems that we're having to confront in the United States, in Germany, and in the UK. So that's the dialogue that needs knitting together.
Okay. Other thoughts, comments? Tell us who you are.
Okay, I'm Tom Curley. I'm a professor at the United States Naval War College, and I got a program called Ethics in Emerging Military Technology Graduate Program for our senior leaders in the military and government here in the U.S. The question I have is with respect to ethics of technology. I've done some preliminary research, and I noticed that the UK and their think tanks and universities have really picked up the speed of AI ethics. I was quite impressed with what I saw. How much, does Parliament rely upon ethics council advice and research done by your universities and think tanks for your policies in for the United Kingdom? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So the truth is not very much, but Parliament at the beginning of this year became really concerned about this ethical space and this ethical gap. And so we've actually just created, we passed laws on this about 6 months ago to create a new Center for AI Ethics. And that will be what we call an independent, non-departmental public body. So it will have a team that is appointed on the basis of merit. It should be quite well funded. And that team will be tasked with creating ethical advice on AI questions to enrich the public debate. So we had a similar initiative in the field of embryology research that was created about 10, 12 years ago. And as lawmakers, we just found it invaluable to be able to have a place where we could refer complex ethical issues. And look, I mean, we're going to have tons of them. I mean, in particular, in the Council of Europe, we've already started a debate about how can democracies defend themselves against active measures. And how can we protect ourselves against what's politely called information integrity, what's more popularly known as fake news. How can we create defenses against these challenges while preserving the freedom of speech, which is the essence of our democracy? You know, so the council, actually one of the most important organizations internationally that has done good work on this is the Club de Madrid, which is a really important industry association of former prime ministers and presidents. They have a really useful program on information integrity, and they do a lot of work with a center some of you may have come across, which is NATO Stratcom, which is based up in Riga in the Baltic, which is actually a center of excellence within NATO, and which is tasked by NATO members with particular bits of research. They're much more kind of action orientated than focused on ethics. And so my forecast is that over the next year, we're going to have to bring together some of the output of institutions like NATO Stratcom and test it with the ethical research agenda of the new center that we've set up in London. But, you know, I just, you know, we need to find a way of not doing this in isolation in the UK. It needs to be wired into a global dialogue.
Should there, must there, is there? Pardon? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm Byrne with the Boston Global Forum. Is there or should there be in your constitutional amendment a right to privacy? To be admitted to your arena, for instance, there may be some people that should be 18 to prevent fake news having, being able to identify who's speaking may be of great value. How do you balance those two?
So I don't have good answers to that, but I mean, the right to privacy has got to be absolutely core. And this is going to have really significant implications for data ownership. So this will operate, I think, at two levels. So we're already having a debate now about how we can create, for example, algorithmic competition. So even if Facebook has a lot of my private data, is there a case actually for opening up what algorithms I can import to operate on that data, because ultimately that data belongs to me. So there are questions that we had during the GDPR bill in Parliament about data portability. So do you just have the right to own your own data, make it portable, move it between platforms, or do you actually, should you enjoy the ability to keep data with an existing platform and import your algorithms into it? So there's a bunch of questions around personal data. There's then going to be a bunch of significant questions around your share of anonymized data. So most people in the UK think that the biggest upside of AI in the future will be in the health system. We have tons of brilliant health data here because of a National Health Service. A lot of it is anonymized, but there will be tremendous value in exploiting that anonymized data. Now, as a citizen, what's my slice? What's my share of that new wealth that's created? And should I be able to have the right to monetize that for me personally? Or should there be some kind of sovereign wealth fund or a sovereign data fund that operates at the national level, that generates income, that, I don't know, pays off debt or pays, you know, for tax reductions? I don't know. So without kind of well-defined levels of privacy, we don't just have issues like the important one you raise about essentially the right to anonymity. We have some of these much bigger competition issues and some of these national ownership questions as well. And, you know, my card's on the table. We're just at the very beginning of trying to figure that stuff out. So we need help.
Who's next?
Hi, Liam. Thank you so much for your remarks. For those of you in the room and for yourself, my name is Nisha. I'm a teaching fellow here at Harvard, and I work with Derek Revron. I'm also on the leadership team of a UK-based company called Rainbird. You might remember from our email exchanges. Rainbird scales best practice decision-making within organizations regulations and makes it codifies it and makes it available at scale across businesses. We are a scale up in that sense, and we are expanding to the US. One thing that we've noticed though is we call ourselves an AI-powered automation platform. The AI hype is real across, reporters, across policymakers. What have you and your colleagues done as far as education in the AI space and understanding the nuances of AI technology to ensure that regulation is meeting the needs of innovation at the same time?
So the truth is almost none. And but you shouldn't draw too many implications from that. Basically, the bandwidth for anything that is non-Brexit in the UK has sucked all the life out of our political process and our poor civil servants as well. I mean, that's pretty much all they're doing. So, there's a very, very small number of people here in the British Parliament and in the British policy space who are really beginning to get stuck into this now. And we're just trying to marry together some of the lessons about economic history. Our national security strategy has gone through huge changes over the last 15 months following the attacks in Salisbury, and the new kind of awareness, overdue in my view, about different security policy we now confront in Russia. So, we really are now in one of those frustrating positions where all the bandwidth in politics is focused on this kind of existential national question for us. And we're just not focusing on the stuff that's going to be really, really important for us in the medium to long term. So, we often say here in London that all revolutions start with a few small people in a room, and this revolution has a very small number of people in the room right now. But that's a plea for help, by the way.
Anyone else?
Good morning, sir. My name is Joe. I'm a student here as well. Also here on behalf of Professor Reverend, studying journalism. And I wanted to pose a question to you. Do you think fake news really changes anyone's mind, or do you think it really operates more on a confirmation bias? And I would expand on that by saying that editing fake news on social media does not seem to address a social chasm. Rather, it sounds opaque. It gives a lot of power to corporate entities to quash speech that is, while undesirable and horrific, still a right. It sounds anti-competitive, and Justices Holmes and Brandis showed us the value of a faith in a marketplace of ideas to voice our ideas. What do you propose to address the widening chasm of social distrust outside of an enforced social media news editing regime? How else can we combat disinformation operations?
So that's a really challenging set of questions there, and very thoughtful. So I guess when we so I'm one of a small group of legislators who have really focused on what we think is malign Russian influence in the Brexit debate. And what our analysis basically revealed is what I referred to slightly elliptically in the speech about the dark social playbook. What we really could see is this ecosystem that was put together between hackers like Cozy Bear or Fancy Bear. You can then trace the way in which that information is either spun or edited or reinterpreted on fake news sites. We then see really extensive, very well-resourced troll farms, then dial up those stories on Twitter. And then once the row is really cooking on Twitter, it gets imported into Facebook groups, and then you get dark money switched on to circulate that story in Facebook groups on a scale of about 25-1 compared to when you put Facebook and Twitter side by side. So the amplification spiral is really, really significant. And so, there's a bunch of new defenses and new regulations and laws and new regulators, by the way, that will be needed to police this. But you're absolutely right to say that part of our challenge here is what I think some American commentators have called tribal epistemology. So basically, what you believe to be true depends on what tribe you would like to belong to, what kind of group in society you would like to be a member of. And this is, it was this observation that actually first took me back to John Rawls, because this idea of the overlapping consensus is needed now more than ever before. And to be honest, that is what politicians have got to focus on now. So, you know, there will always be politicians who try and lead by dividing and ruling. And we've got more than enough of those, thanks very much. And what is really now needed are politicians who will focus hard on building that overlapping consensus. So, you know, a little example of that is the work that I've had to do here, trying to map the overlap between Islamic values and the European Convention on Human Rights. I serve the biggest Muslim constituency in Britain. We've had a number of significant attacks and arrests in my community. And I realize, you know, from the grassroots work that I do, that unless I can knit together that overlapping consensus of values that we hold in common, then it's going to be really hard for us as a community to advance together. So this is really quite hard stuff, but you know what, that is what you pay politicians to go to work to do. So the task of lawmaking is obviously time consuming and difficult, but actually we need politicians to become much better moral leaders in the future. And what moral leaders do is they find ways of knitting society together. It's something actually Governor Dukakis inspired a lot of people in this country with some of the brilliant oratory of his going back years and years and years. That's the kind of example of leadership that we now need. Sorry, that's a slightly philosophical answer to what was kind of a hard and fast question, but that's the best I've got.
Hi, I'm Rafi Yahalom, an affiliated researcher at MIT down the river. Thanks very much for your very thought-provoking comments. Particularly intrigued by your notion of the digital Bill of Rights. And I'm wondering what lessons can be learned from the GDPR process and implementation for that Bill of Rights, and also what is the expected future of GDPR in the UK following Brexit?
Yeah, great question. So the truth is that GDPR was done in quite a top-down way, and it was successful because it kept to quite a narrow focus, in particular, you know, around privacy, as the name of the bill suggests. I don't think that is going to be good enough for the next stage forward. And you know, we've been writing codes of rights in our country since the Magna Carta in 1215. And you know, I guess if there's one lesson that we've learned from that process down the centuries, is that it's best to try and do this bottom up. And so what we need to try and pinpoint, what we need to try and create is a bottom up process that surfaces these kinds of concerns and questions. And so deliberative techniques like citizens' juries, I think, will become much more important in the future. And you know, having lived and loved America and having done a lot of work in Europe over the years, I'm just really keen that we try and find a way of doing this across a wide space as possible. And I actually think it's going to be easier to pinpoint the consensus than we think. You know, it sounds like a very grand exercise. You know, I'm a great believer in the public's common sense. And so I would like our process to begin kind of bottom up. Obviously, you can't start with a blank piece of paper, which is why, you know, I've tried to kind of write something down. So that's the kind of process that I think we need to go through. Now, in the UK, we have a massive strategic interest in getting this right, because we have to keep what's called an adequacy agreement with the European Union. So the European Union has got to sign off on the adequacy of our data protection regime. If it doesn't, we can't have free movement of data across Europe. That will hit about 3/4 of our services exports, which are digitally enabled. So, you know, we're a services country, we're a great services center in the world. if we can't export services, that's pretty economically disastrous. So we basically have to do whatever is necessary to keep what's called regulatory harmonization with our neighbors on the continent.
Who's next? Yes.
Hi, my name is Jessica Deere. I'm a fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society here at Harvard. I'm also the executive director of the digital rights organization that's based in the Middle East and covers the Arab region, as well as a member of the advisory network for the Freedom Online Coalition, which the UK government is a member of. And I'm wondering a couple of things. I'm really curious in how you are defining digital rights in this global bill of digital rights. This is an exercise that I've been through personally and sort of trying to figure out what is the definition, because there isn't sort of a standardized definition. And to what extent your global bill of digital rights actually is grounded in human rights law, and also if you're aware of the many charters of digital rights that have been drafted by civil society over the past 20-25 years, and if you're referencing any of them in your global bill of digital rights. And then sort of separately, I'm curious, like I was just a couple of weeks ago at the Freedom Online Coalition conference in Berlin. And for those who don't know, it is a group of about 27 countries, both European and other countries, Mexico, Tunisia. And they have made a commitment to online freedom. And every year they get together and talk about policy, things about algorithmic transparency, 5G, et cetera. And one of the key findings or sort of discussion points from that conference was that in order to create the good policy and legislation, in order to modernize the legislation, as you're saying, we need a lot more data to make evidence-based policy. And a lot of that data is trapped in companies. And I'm wondering if maybe a first step is to create policy around sort of forcing companies to make that data more available for policy-making purposes, and what work you might be doing on that front, if any. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So I would love to pretend that that I was the author of the Bill of Digital Rights that we presented in Parliament. But no, I'm not that clever. So we worked really hard with civil society groups to try and knit this together. And actually, where we started was with the rights of the child. So we have had a number of groups here in the UK, in part led by Baroness Beeban Kidron, who was the producer actually of The English Patient, the film you may have heard of. She's been running an organization called Five Rights for some time, which really looks at the rights of the digital rights of children. And we found this a really arresting idea, and that was our starting point, really. That's when we went out to civil society groups and lawyers to say, okay, well, look, if we tried to turn this this manifesto of digital rights for children into a bill of digital rights, would it work? And so that's what then took us to write the Charter of Rights and debate it in Parliament. And we were a bit surprised, actually, that it caught people's imagination, because people were just looking for a wider range of first principles to help us steer through the future. And so that's why we're now kind of starting this process of going much wider and saying, okay, is there a market for developing these ideas in Europe and in the United States? In terms of data locked up in private companies, I think you're right. I think a lot of the challenge in the debates that we have today is not evidence-based policy; it's policy-based evidence, and we've got to kind of reintroduce facts, and that does mean that we're going to have to be, I think, much tougher on liberating data in the future, which is why I suspect the most controversial element in this debate could well be around data ownership. Who actually owns data that has been collated and synthesized at an anonymized level, that is a common product, if you like. But at the moment, it's being enclosed, like the enclosure of the commons here before the Industrial Revolution. That's going to really impede progress. And so we've got to find a way of handling this in a way that fits within our free market system. Not least because if we don't find ways of doing this, then the application and development of AI in Europe and America will fall behind others who aren't fettered by these rules. So we have a big debate in Britain at the moment about Chinese advances in AI, and people quickly observe that when you've got state control over such swathes of data, it's obviously easier for Chinese firms to accelerate in this particular field. Now, I deliberately said that, you know, a Chinese approach to this is not going to work for us in Europe or America, but we are going to have to find ways of clarifying ownership over data that should be processed for the common good.
I think we've got time for one additional question or comment. Who wants to?
Hello, James Loft. I'm the Chief Operating Officer from Rainbow Technologies, so also representing the UK. I just wanted to ask you, Liam, on a lot of what you've spoken about has been around legislation, and you talked a little bit there about the digital rights for children, and you also talked in the law around you know, the responsibilities of parenthood and that towards children. I guess from that perspective, when you think about stepping beyond the legislation of now, what are you thinking your advice would be to your parliamentary colleagues on education for future skill sets, or even education around how to behave in a digital world in the future? What would your advice to those colleagues be?
Yeah, this is very timely question, actually. So I and a number of colleagues recently put together, I can use my other prop here, this little book, which I can send you the link to, and it's a book I edited for the IMF World Bank Parliamentary Network on the future of work. And this issue of education, as you'd expect, looms large. We actually ran a poll of teachers in this country about a month ago, which shocked me, actually, because it showed that 55% of teachers don't think our education system is fit for the future. And when we probed a little bit, it basically came down to a lack of creative problem-solving skills, a lack of emphasis on communication, a lack of emphasis on teamwork. So I was quite surprised at how worried teachers are about the shortcomings of our education system. So I think there are going to have to be three sets of changes ahead. So one is obviously to the basic curriculum. We're going to have to change emphasis a bit, put a bigger emphasis on problem solving, creativity. And people forget, you know, in the first industrial revolution in our country, Matthew Boulton, who was the great pioneer of steam engines, he employed the best engineers in the world, but he also employed the best artists in the world. And it was that fusion of engineering genius and creative brilliance that, you know, really created and powered the Industrial Revolution in my hometown of Birmingham in the 1760s, 1770s. So changes to the curriculum. Second, the focus on universal digital literacy will be really important, because we are going to have to see new investment into digital literacy. And third, you know, we're going to need a kind of education system that takes you from ABC to PhD, but provides ladders for people to be able to get on no matter where they're starting in life. So, you know, at the moment, we have a very highly structured education system that does a reasonable job at getting children from, you know, where they are up to a university degree. But actually, it's pretty bad for those who perhaps went into the workforce without much of an education. And it's hopelessly inadequate when it comes to retraining. And so, you know, a lot of my constituents who are in their 50s, you know, they're now genuinely worried about how on earth they're going to stay in work for the next 15 to 20 years, given the technology change that's coming. And, you know, if there's one thing we've learned in this Brexit stuff here, it's that when people are anxious about the future, they vote for populists, they vote for nationalists. And so it's why I kind of say, look, we need a Project Hope for the future of automation, but that does entail a very different social contract in the future and a very different kind of education system.
William, I have to say that this has been one of the most thought-provoking hours in a long, long time. And it's not only our great privilege and honor to have you with us, but I hope we can stay in touch closely because from a political standpoint, this country, I don't think we're even off the ground on this whole area. And we need lots of guidance from a lot of people, including yourself. So I want to say thanks to you on behalf of everybody here. And on a personal note, I want you to know that my dear wife, Kitty, was brought up Jewish only to discover at the age of 17 that she had a grandfather named George Washington Byrne, whose parents were Irish immigrants from County Clare.
Ah.
So who knows?
Clare Burns. Okay.
Yeah. I will tell her that. But this has been.
Give her my very best.
I hope to keep you very close to us and look to you for guidance and wisdom. As you know, I'm a great believer in consensus building. And not having much of it these days in the States, and I hope we get back to that. But it's simply a reminder that, especially these new technologies, it's the consensus builder that we need. And I hope with your help, we can build them here and across the globe. But can we have a round of applause for our Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I don't know about you, I thought that was terrific and very thought-provoking. I don't know that I've spent 2 minutes thinking about this, but I will now. I can tell you when I always speak on behalf of all of you. Let's say that. So, thanks. Okay, we've got a number of other things that we're going to be doing between now and noontime. And I want to start with Cam Hickey, who is an Emmy Award-winning journalist, photographer, a developer, and he's now with us at Harvard at the Shorenstein Center, and very much part of the County School at the University. Cam, where are you? You're on.
Can I have the... Good morning. That was a really interesting top-level view. I really enjoyed the last presentation. I'm going to take us deep in the weeds about this big issue that we've been focusing on. So just as background, I've spent the last 10 years at the PBS NewsHour reporting on science technology. And over the last 2 years, shifted to focus exclusively on mis and disinformation, the way it spreads on social media. And so the work that I've been doing at the Shorenstein Center is an extension of a lot of reporting that I was doing, a lot of software development to try and understand this phenomenon better. At the Shorenstein Center, we have a project called the Information Disorder Lab. The idea here is that there's a bigger, broader problem than what people want to call just fake news. We look at it across 2 different potential risk vectors. One is content that is false, and the other is content that is harmful. This buckets the information into 3 distinct types: misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. So misinformation is just stuff that's false. Disinformation is stuff that's false but also intended to be harmful. Malinformation is information that is not necessarily false but is still in fact harmful. But so what is this really? I think it's important to think through case studies and examples to really understand this. These 7 types were identified by Claire Wardle, the founder of our lab, who recently wrote a report, I guess it was last year, for the Council of Europe that talked about this phenomenon of information disorder. And at the time, she classified the problem into these categories. So there's going from the least harmful to the most harmful. Satire, misleading, imposter content, fabricated, these other ideas, false connection, false context, and manipulated content. But what do these ideas really mean? I want to walk you through an example of each. So I want to start with the idea of what is fabricated content or a fabricated idea. This is an image that received a ton of engagement across social media, and it alleges that George Soros is related to Adam Schiff because George Soros' son is married to Adam Schiff's daughter, Adam Schiff's sister. My apologies. This is in fact not true. It's been debunked numerous times, yet continue to spread frequently across social media in various forms. Most notably this one, in which the person who clearly knew this was not true decided to tease us all by putting in hot pink letters at the bottom, "You can't make this up." So this is what frequently we refer to as fake news, right? A completely fabricated story. But this is only one tiny piece of the puzzle. This is an example of what we frequently refer to as false context. I'm going to read this out to you because I think it's really important. It says, illegal aliens are far more likely to commit federal crimes based on statistics. They're 7% of the population, yet they commit 72% of drug possessions, 33% of money laundering, 29% of drug trafficking, 22% of murders, 18% of fraud. Build that wall. Now this statement and versions of it have appeared on Tucker Carlson, they've appeared across other Fox News shows and across social media. So I have a question for everyone. Who believes that these statistics are accurate? Can you raise your hand if you think this is true? So we fact-checked it. In fact, it's completely accurate. These statistics are real. And the reason they get to say them and the reason they're shocking is because of one piece of context there that's kind of hidden. Federal crimes. Most crimes are not prosecuted at the federal level. In fact, a very small percentage of them are. And in fact, only at the federal level do we carefully document who is and is not a citizen. So we only really know this for sure at the federal level. But so this is a factual statement that's been floating around for the last 3 or 4 years, or variations on it because we have new statistics every year. And it serves to bolster the conclusion that undocumented immigrants are a significant problem in terms of our crime. Without that other context, this factual information becomes incredibly misleading and I would argue incredibly dangerous. I think it's one of the more significant pieces of information that spread during the election cycle that led to the current administration. Just so we're clear, this information is does not lean on one side. This is actually, it's also an imposter website, but that's not the point of it. This is an imposter website that's a left-leaning website that creates a false connection between information. Donald Trump made a statement about whether or not all men are created equal, and he said that's not true. Different people are born with different endowments. But this article tried to say that Donald Trump said the Declaration is not true. The Declaration of Independence is not true. So they're making a false connection between a piece of a statement that he made and a much broader idea, which in fact is inaccurate and completely misleads the point, misleads the audience on the point that Donald Trump was trying to make. This is a classic example of imposter content. A website called the New York Herald was registered 3 or 4 months ago, but that newspaper has not been published for decades. But it appears on social media as though it is in fact a website like one you would be likely to trust. This is an example you may all be familiar with. This is a form of manipulated content. One of the Parkland shooting survivors was photographed for the Teen Vogue magazine tearing apart a shooting target. Trolls on 4chan decided that it would be funny to Photoshop in the United States Constitution and have her tearing that apart. The manipulated version of this image spread far and wide on social media and then was amplified by various people trying to debunk the idea. So it reached an incredibly wide audience. And satire itself can be incredibly problematic. You may have seen recently a Washington Post story about a guy, I think his name is Christopher Blair, who runs a Facebook page called The Last Line of Defense. This is one of his products. It says, Congresswoman Atisha Nubbins of Delaware just pushed through this bill that will put an upper age limit on voting. Now, despite that probably being a great idea, Atisha Nubbins is not a real person. This photograph was stolen from somewhere else. The idea behind this piece of information was actually that it was created by someone who's liberal to troll conservatives, to tease them into believing these things, which in fact they do quite frequently. So even though it was intended as satire, it was interpreted literally by thousands and thousands of people that we identified on social media. So where does all this content come from? I actually think in the previous presentation, Liam talked about the same exact idea. You may even have seen this presentation before. But this information comes from, it can appear at any of these levels, but it frequently migrates through these different stages. So it starts on the fringe web, these dark spaces where trolls frequently live. It migrates through lots of secure networks, most notably WhatsApp and Discord. It frequently gets promoted on junk news websites, Facebook groups, and then penetrates mainstream social media, and in some cases penetrates mainstream traditional media. Information that we're seeing enters at various different stages here, but the point is that frequently we can trace something that travels through all of them, and we have to be monitoring at all of these stages to really understand the scale and significance of the problem. So I want to talk briefly about one aspect of information disorder that we spend a lot of time focusing on. It's this idea of junk news pages. I've invested a lot of time in trying to understand this particular space because it's a really important vector for the amplification of content. Junk news websites are websites that we define as having a combination of these criteria. So they frequently share articles that have clickbait headlines, missing or fake bylines, actual false content. I can go on and on. There's various ideas here that you can sort of understand in a broad sense. The point is there are a specific kind of content that is not our traditional mainstream content. But the big question is, how do we find these guys? Because news sites like these are appearing every day. The platforms are taking action against them very frequently, but they have a variety of incentives, either to spread mis or disinformation or to make money. And so they're constantly reappearing. So we need techniques to try and track them and identify them as they reappear over time. So it turns out the key to finding these guys is this woman. Her name is Betty Manlove. She's 86 years old. She's a Christian conservative. She's a Trump supporter. She lives in Indianapolis, Indiana. She's not a bot. She's not a Russian sock puppet. She's actually my grandmother. So in monitoring and investigating the world of junk news, what I found frequently was that hundreds and hundreds of Facebook pages that I was looking at, my grandmother had liked those pages. We've all got a grandmother or an uncle or a cousin or even maybe a former college roommate that fits into this category, right? And they're certainly not all conservative. I have plenty of people on the left in my social media sphere that do the same thing. But what I discovered was looking at my grandmother's likes on Facebook, I could find a lot of other sources that were not already identified, not identified by Snopes and PolitiFact and all the other sources, not identified by any of our research, but that my grandmother was identifying very effectively. And so what I built was a piece of software to essentially aggregate all the grandmas, right? To monitor over time what kinds of things they were, people who engaged with some junk news, what else were they engaging with? And this turned out to be a really effective system for revealing the next source the very next day. So why does this matter? Back in July, we held a big convening at the Shorenstein Center at the Kennedy School, where we brought a bunch of journalists from all over the country to talk about this issue of information disorder. As a sort of experiment, we collected their Facebook fans for every one of them. So right over here on the left is the BBC News, which has the highest number of Facebook fans, right on down. Somewhere in the middle is the PBS NewsHour, where I used to work, and there's local sources all the way down. Now, we also have this big database of junk news sources. So I took a similar sampling of those junk news sources and looked at how many Facebook fans they have. You can see there's sites from the right, sites from the left, pro-Trump sites, anti-Trump sites, all different kinds of junk and misinformation and clickbait content. Why it's important is when you look at them together, right? So sure, the most powerful or most popular mainstream news sources have more fans than them, but right after that, these other sources have massive reach. And this is just on Facebook, right? We're not talking about WhatsApp or Twitter or any of these darker spaces. Just on the most popular social network, they have this massive reach. And even when a platform like Facebook decides to deplatform some of them, as we've seen over the midterm season, they've removed various Facebook pages. And I haven't been able to update this slide yet, but if I could click, you'd see about 4 or 5 of those red bars disappear. A whole lot of them still remain, and a whole lot of new ones have appeared since. So this problem is much bigger than just looking at fake news, and it is much bigger than just trying to fact check or provide sensible news from mainstream news sources. So I just wanted to wrap up with some of the sort of key takeaways, and I put these together for this audience. We have a lot of different research going on at the lab and a lot of different kinds of takeaways, but I want to talk about a few. So the first one is this idea that coordination comes in many flavors, right? So we have the idea of bots. We talk a lot about bots, we talk a lot about troll farms, but a lot of coordination is more organic, right? There's one great example I like to give is hashtag Trump train. If you go and look on Twitter and look for this hashtag Trump train, what you'll see is a really odd kind of behavior that happens on Twitter where users share a bunch of other names of other users that you ought to also follow and start retweeting. And these are real people sharing and generating this idea of creating the echo chamber of information around their particular topic. And it's a form of coordination that is completely organic, yet still has a lot of the same impacts as identifying bots, for example. So the next one is one I've kind of talked about a lot already, but this idea that information disorder is rarely obvious, right? The nuanced content is equally pervasive. I'd argue in many cases it's more pervasive, and it's incredibly problematic. The example I gave about federal convictions and a lack of context is a really important one to think about, because frequently the way that this information creates problems in our society are not the obvious ways. It's all of these really subtle ways. And then this one, which we've heard about a little bit earlier today, hate and bigotry really do drive this conversation. They're the most potent force that we see continuously appearing across all the platforms that we're looking at and across all the different vectors of mis and disinformation. All different forms of hate and bigotry continue to exist despite the fact that the platforms are removing the most egregious abusers, and despite the fact that they have really strong policies and technologies to identify this content. Every day you find new and really challenging content that is spread far and wide. And this is was a really interesting takeaway from a lot of the work that we've done monitoring over the last 6 months during the midterm season, is that this network is really reactive, right? What is happening is directly a result of what is happening in the wider world. So one of the ideas that we had for the lab was to monitor across a whole bunch of different topics over the course of the midterm season, and we built a lot of different mechanisms for doing this, monitoring all those junk news sites, identifying different topic areas. We looked at things like immigration issues, we looked at the environment, we looked at anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and then the Kavanaugh hearing happened. And when the Kavanaugh hearing happened, the entire space of mis and disinformation on social media dried up, and the only thing that was flooding into it was all different forms of mis and disinformation about the Kavanaugh hearing, about Christine Blasey Ford. And so it was a really odd moment for us where all the work we were trying to do stopped for a period of 3 weeks, and we had to sort of pivot and only follow this because it was the only thing that people were publishing. And the same thing happened again with all of the hype around the caravan, and it continues to happen with every new major issue that we see. So there is persistent forms of mis and disinformation, and there are persistent actors who are trying to get their message across, but we have to be really responsive to the way that they are reacting if we're going to continue to understand this phenomenon. So that's actually the gist of my presentation. I'd love to take questions.
I'm Michael Briggsman. I'm an industry analyst, and I started a interview show on digital disruption called CXO Talk. It sounds, your presentation is very interesting, but it sounds like at this stage you're focused on creating taxonomies and identifying the different sources, but there wasn't too much about what do we do about it.
So that's the portion of the presentation I wanted to give. Tom, unfortunately, who had to leave, kind of gave me a briefing on what we'd have time to talk about. So we focused primarily on that. In fact, we're developing in the new year a specific project on taxonomy to actually broaden out those 7 types. So you're absolutely right. That is a key focus in both trying to understand the scale and shape of the problem and in the ways to describe it. We really think that it's critical to do that first before we can define policy prescriptions or that it can either be government instituted or from the private industry. We have a lot of suggestions. I've frequently been asked what's the best way to avoid social media, or it's the best way to avoid disinformation on social media, and obviously my answer is always just stay off of it. But I think that breaking these companies down, breaking them apart isn't going to be an effective solution, and we have to look at ways that we can teach them how to understand this phenomenon better so that they can take action. One of the things that we talked about at the end of the last presentation was this issue about the conflict between data privacy and data transparency. And this is a conflict that we've recognized as a really significant one as we move forward, and probably the most critical to either understanding this problem or developing policy prescriptions to solve it, right? So in the example I gave with trying to monitor and understand the behavior of my own grandmother, to do that effectively across the network requires a level of data transparency that we just don't have today on these mainstream platforms. But that level of data transparency runs completely counter to all of our concerns about privacy. So I think we have to wrestle with understanding where we want to end up on that spectrum between transparency and privacy before we can tell governments or companies what to do.
Barry Nolan, former communications director for the Joint Economic Committee. When you talk to your grandmother and you say, "Grandma, that's just not true," do you ever have success in convincing them? And so, what do you do?
So I will direct you, if anyone's interested, to the PBS NewsHour. If you search for junk news on PBS NewsHour, you'll actually see I profiled my grandmother in a piece we did for her, where we talked actually a lot about these issues. So it's really interesting to hear a perspective and a similar perspective from somebody who's liberal. It's really difficult, and I've talked to a lot more people than just my grandmother about this. People do not believe that they are being manipulated, even when they tell you things that clearly come from some form of manipulation that they've experienced. And when you try to present them with alternative facts, the legitimate facts, I would argue, they frequently find ways to reject them or discount them and maintain the version of the world that they're comfortable with. So my grandmother, for example, believes that Barack Obama was born in Kenya. She believes that Michelle Obama might be a man. She believes that David Hogg is a crisis actor. All those things we discussed. She expressed a willingness or an openness to hear some other evidence, but she was pretty confident based on all the things that she knew and understand that those were the right ways to understand the world. I don't know if explaining to someone a different set of facts, a more legitimate set of facts, is a successful way of convincing them of something. But to go back to the idea of what are some policy prescriptions, I'll give you a little bit more detail about how we understand this, right? Why does my grandmother follow, turns out, 1,400 junk news sources on Facebook, right? She follows them because those sources wanted to generate revenue, and so they created ads. And they ran ads targeting people like my grandmother with things like, if you think Donald Trump is the greatest president ever, click like. And once she clicked like, she then became a fan of that page, right? So even if she follows the New York Times and the BBC and the PBS NewsHour, she follows all those other sites, all those other red bars, right? And so the flood of information that she's seeing is heavily weighted towards all of this other stuff. So thinking about ways that we can change the power dynamic, change the balance of content that is flooding her feed so that what she's continuously hit over the head with is a different set of facts, she's more likely to believe them, especially if they're framed in the context that she wants to understand them, right? So she's a Christian conservative, so you might say, should we frame the issue of climate change or climate change denial in terms of her faith? Like, is that the right way to address someone like that, to make it clear that these two things don't align in the way that you've been thinking about it, and here's another way? Or to ignore trying to debunk them completely and present just a unified view that matches the language that she's familiar with. And it's an incredibly challenging problem.
So I see your grandmother as the subject matter expert in identifying fake news, right? I'm intrigued. You mentioned that you built a technology to identify what is the next thing she's going to like. Can you go into a bit of detail of what that technology was you built that?
Sure. So the basic idea is, given a seed set of sources that we know are junk, we look at who engages with that junk. And there are a variety of ways that you can engage. You can like, you can share, you can follow, you can comment on a piece of content, identifying other content by the users that engage with that stuff. So it's a pretty basic thing. For example, if on Twitter you can say, if you find a suspect user, who's retweeting that suspect user and what other users are they retweeting, right? It's really basic network analysis, but what it produces is a feed not just of other Facebook pages in this example, but all those Facebook pages are sharing links, right? So each of those links are frequently new domains, and those new domains, in the system that we've built, we literally see every week new websites are registered. Back a year ago, we were seeing multiple websites a day appearing, and the same day the domain was registered, they were popping up on Facebook and sharing new content. So it's really about aggregating both of those things, the Facebook content in this case. We're also working on YouTube and Twitter and yes, and putting them all together, and looking at how the content migrates through all of those platforms.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't know if there was a microphone. So the way that you were just describing it, sorry, do I need it on the but the way that you were just describing it is that the sort of moment of virality of these junk news sites and other things happens in the ad space, right? And that is how your grandmother is becoming exposed to all these and following them. So to me, that says that we shouldn't be thinking about regulating the content, but that we should be thinking about regulating advertising. And I mean, there's some people who are working on targeted advertising as, you know, sort of this nexus of where the exponential sort of distribution takes place. And it seems to me like it's just always going to be a losing battle to try. I mean, we know from political campaigns that emotion is always more compelling than fact, and that, you know, to try and sort of address human nature is sort of always going to be a losing battle. But if there's a nexus of power that happens in the targeted advertising, that's where we should be focusing our attention.
I completely agree. Just to clarify, I would say that it's not the moment of virality. It's the audience acquisition, right? So some content becomes more viral than others, but the advertising system is a significant part of audience acquisition. Back 9 months ago, we were inside of Facebook reporting with them as they were developing their plan for advertising transparency around political ads. We had a lot of conversations and debates about the logic of what they were doing. Then they rolled out their platform, and we became an early partner in monitoring the content coming out of their political ads transparency system. And what we saw frequently were ads that were run on a specific topic. The one that is most interesting to me is the one around Islamophobia. So the use of the term Sharia in ads. And what you could see if you go to their political ad transparency tool, you type in Sharia, it is a whole lot of ads that are run by candidates or PACs or other entities that have a paid for by label, right? This political ad transparency. And then you see a whole bunch of others that were run without a paid for by label and then were taken down. But because they were political, they still have them in their system. And so those entities that ran those other ads stopped running ads. So it actually does demonstrate the effectiveness of the system. But I raised a question recently to the guy who runs the ad transparency system on Facebook. We had a Twitter conversation, which was, why is it only political ads? Why is it that we only have to verify our identity when we're running ads about political content? It creates a couple of conflicts, right? So one of the big problems that they had early on in the system was that if the New York Times wants to run a promotion on a story about Donald Trump, they now have to do that same political ad transparency that we expect of politicians. And fine, the New York Times can do that, but if any news organization that wants to run a news story promotion has to follow these same rules, that feels a bit unfair. But if we said the rules apply to everyone in every circumstance, I can imagine lots of other spaces aside from politics where it's important to me to understand who's promoting a particular idea in an ad, especially when the ad isn't for a product, it's really promoting some idea or trying to manipulate you in some other way. So I certainly think that it's a significant area that demands, I'm not sure if it's regulation, because we seem to always fail when we try to do that, but I certainly think that the expectation that there should be universal ad transparency is a great start.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Elliot Wyman, and I'm on AI World here with the Boston Global Forum as well. So this reminds me of some research we just did. If you go to YouTube, and which serves 1 billion users worldwide, and serves up 1 billion videos a day, and these statistics are true for Facebook and others, 70% of all YouTube videos that are viewed each day are driven by the AI, machine learning.
The recommendations.
Right. Similar to Netflix. It's not clear to me, actually, if I use CNN or Fox, if they have recommendation engines in there. In other words, these, AI in the digital era feeds in and manipulates every one of us. And you can't stop that unless you, 35%, by the way, of all Google searches are driven by AI, and it increases the last 5 years it was 32, 35, and 38. So the point is that your grandmother is like everybody else. Most people don't think they're getting manipulated. But I don't know how many people here feel like they're getting manipulated by YouTube if you're a YouTube user. Nobody, right? Maybe you know it, right? So the point is, if I believe you need to develop ethics, that every one of these companies have their own efforts underway. And whether you regulate, your point is you can't really regulate all this content. Maybe flag it, saying Facebook says, okay, hey, if you want to read advertisements, beware, you may be getting manipulated, which I don't know if they're ever going to do because they depend on advertising revenue, on everybody else, right? So this broad set of standards of ethics being developed independently by Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Dukakis and so forth, and which Liam was talking about earlier, seems to be what you need, because if there's a generally accepted view of ethics and a stamp of ethics approval, by everybody, maybe maybe when you're using too much of this, you're reading too much left-wing stuff or right-wing stuff, and maybe flags start popping up and say, listen, you got to realize the stuff might be manipulating you. So maybe shut that off, because you can shut off that in YouTube and you can shut it off on Facebook if you actually go in and control the algorithms that present to yourself to. Anyway, that's just a comment.
Yeah, so a couple of things. First, I think it's important to recognize that we're getting manipulated not by the algorithms themselves exclusively, but also by the people who are manipulating the algorithms, right? So people are figuring out ways to game these systems, and I think that's, and we just have the very basic understanding of that, right? We see lots of examples of it. One that's been quite interesting to us recently that we're researching, a bunch of Facebook pages were removed that were publishing junk news, hyper-partisan, and disinformation content. One of them was a website called Right Wing News Official. It was part of a whole set of them. We found on YouTube a bunch of articles from Right Wing News Official that were taken the text, converted it to speech using digital technology, and superimposed images on it, and uploaded to YouTube. Almost every article from this website, and then it turns out our research has revealed many, many other similar websites, ones that are still on Facebook, ones that are not, other kinds of mis and disinformation. We built a piece of software to try and identify this phenomenon on YouTube and collect as many channels as we could. We found, I think in the neighborhood so far of 150 different channels that share this content. I think it's in the tens up to maybe 100,000 videos that we found. The total views on this content, over 2 billion. So, even when one platform tries to take action on something, a policy violator, or tries to dial down algorithmically using various ethics policies, these gamers find a new way to manipulate the algorithm to reach a different audience. And the problem is, I agree, it absolutely necessitates coordination between these platforms in a way that they're not willing to, but it also critically involves recognition that the incentives are just not aligned, right? When we're talking about advertising, Facebook has some business incentive to reduce mis or disinformation on its platform because they don't like that bad PR. But it turns out when you try and dial it all the way down, you're probably going to lose more audience, you're going to lose more views, you're going to lose more revenue if you took the most extreme version of that. Or if you did another thing that I've wished they would do, but I recognize is impossible, if you took such a proactive view on what was content that didn't pass muster, and then you created a legitimate grievance process to review content and say, no, I actually am from the PBS NewsHour, and this actually is legitimate content, it isn't hate-filled, and you had real humans doing it. But that doesn't scale, right? It doesn't scale to 2 billion users and the volume of content that's going on there. So I think there's a recognition here that if it's Google or it's Facebook, and I think those are really the two primary ones, if we don't accept that we're going to have to radically change the incentive structure, no amount of ethics policies or advancements in AI is going to solve the problem.
Fascinating presentation, Cam.
For Mark, but just the other day in the news, everybody was confronted with the immutable truth that Cohen and Trump were involved in illegal campaign financing. And the Republican leadership says, I think it was Chuck Grassley says, I don't care. Orrin Hatch says, well, he's doing a good job. And I think Mitch McConnell says, I don't watch television. And now how do you, with this overload of information, and the truth is out there, you still don't penetrate the miasma. So can you comment? That's a tough one.
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, I think that in a lot of the reporting that we did around this issue, talking to a lot of big thinkers on it, it was clear that the long-term argument that people make is that what we need is better media literacy, right? We need to be able to better distinguish between what is factual reporting and what is opinion, when we're being spun. I think that that's critically true. I don't think that the education I got had sufficient media literacy training when I was in grammar school and high school. And it's not till you get to higher education that you're really focused on that. And I think that that's long-term a really critical piece of that, because how do we ever make sense of this or try to rationalize around a specific issue, ignoring these bloviators who are just spinning it for whatever their political gain is. But that's to me, that's actually the most significant thing that we should do. But it's a problem that's we're not gonna solve overnight using that hammer.
Do you run the risk of an adverse feedback loop if you were to try and put something in place that prevented stories that said Michelle Obama is actually a man from getting to your grandmother? Does she then believe that the elites are trying to control the real news out there, and she becomes even more convinced that there's evil afoot?
That's already happening, right? I think that is it's not just a risk; it's a reality. On Twitter, there are two dueling viewpoints. One is that conservative voices are being suppressed on the platform, and the other is you're crazy. That's obviously not happening. We have some really interesting research that suggests maybe it is happening. In fact, Twitter analyzes account activity and identifies abusiveness and suppresses some content and doesn't suppress content that it doesn't find abusive. And it turns out the skew on abusiveness seems to be heavily conservative. Now, does that mean that the platform has a bias or that the behavior of the actors is skewed in one direction? It's really hard to answer that question, but it's breeding a lot of suspicion about the ways that these platforms are behaving. And that's just one little nugget, right? Facebook employs third-party fact checkers like Snopes to verify content. And if somebody shares something that has been debunked by Snopes, it still appears in my grandmother's feed, and right below it, it says, you know, fact check from Snopes, right? The reality is a lot of the people that consume this content, they're suspicious of Snopes. They think if Snopes debunked it, that actually means it's probably true because Snopes is part of the left-wing cabal. So it's a huge problem, and it exists. It's not just a theoretical issue.
We've just lost your grandmother.
How do you think your grandmother would have voted if she had never been exposed to false or harmful information?
So I asked her about that. What was actually really interesting was, so she says in our interview that she grew up a Democrat, actually, and grew to, I think 20 years ago, being more conservative. But I also asked her, like, even 10 years ago, you know, or yeah, it's 10 years ago now, but 8 years ago when Barack Obama was elected, how much of this content did you consume? She's like, well, none. I wasn't even on Facebook 10 years ago. How engaged were you with politics? Well, not really. I was engaged with other stuff, right? She was engaged with baking, or she still worked at that time and was, you know, involved in other activities that were about her immediate surroundings. But because of these platforms, she's completely reoriented her attention. She admits that she's addicted to social media and spends hours and hours a day on it. And so I don't know that she would have voted any differently. I think that when we deal with this, you know, primarily two-party system and you fall on one side or the other, the likelihood is you're going to pick the candidate that's part of your tribe, and I think that that was always going to be the part of the tribe. But how vehemently she supported him, like how much she paid attention to the issues, I think that that was exacerbated incredibly by social media.
My name is John Desmond, the editor of AI Trends, the newsletter that comes out to support the AIWS show that I spoke about. And I have a comment / question and a comment. The first part is, I feel in the 2016 election, I'm a mainstream press reader, I'm a journalist, a career journalist, with the Northeastern Journal. But I feel that in the 2016 election, mainstream press got manipulated, especially by WikiLeaks reports that were based on stolen emails that were influenced by the Russians trying to influence the election. But it appeared in the mainstream press, all mainstream press. So I feel let down by that. So I think that in your research, whatever guidance you can provide editors of mainstream press going forward for the kind of decisions they have to make in this environment where they have to be absolutely sure they know where this information is coming from, because they're respected and their integrity is seen at a much higher level than many of these other websites. And, you know, I teach high school students part-time, and I tell them to try to identify the source. I ask them all the time, where do you get your information? Well, when you're on Facebook, you don't know where it comes from. But at least if you know you're reading the New York Times, the Boston Post, the Washington Post, you know it comes from a team of journalists. Try to tell them what that means. But I think it's a new era for editors. And looking back, what would they have done differently? I think they should have decided not to run some of that stuff because they didn't really know where it came from. Here's my comment. Since Facebook was invented by a student at Harvard, while he was at Harvard, I really think it would be great if Harvard could do helping Facebook be a better citizen.
On the last part, I wholeheartedly agree. We actually talk to Facebook representatives somewhat frequently about ways that we can collaborate or get access to data. In the wake of Cambridge Analytica, that's proven to be incredibly difficult, and I think will get more so. And I don't expect a lot of cooperation in the future as they sort of batten down the hatches and fight their fight going forward. In terms of the way that the mainstream media has been manipulated, there is an ongoing debate. We had it this summer when we brought 150 journalists. We had it over at the Kennedy School when we had some distinguished journalists come and talk. It's this debate about whether or not when the president tweets something, that means it's news and we should cover it. And I don't have a definitive opinion on this topic, but I think that recognizing that that's lively debate right now within the world of journalism about whether or not that means something, and therefore we have to, follow the shiny object over and over again. I think that's a lot of what you're talking about in the 2016 election, right? Every campaign rally carried live, all of these, much less meaningful issues taking center stage day in and day out. We haven't really come to terms with, as journalists, how we exercise this incredible power that we have in terms of editorial control, right? We keep getting led in different directions over and over again. And I think that's not the complete solution, right? To have better journalism, because as we talked about, there's a lot of people who aren't paying attention to it. But I certainly think that the debate is skewed so far away from exercising our own, autonomous editorial control, and we're being led way too often.
Other great I must be part of a small group that's never been on Facebook. There's no intention of going there. There's no idea why I'd go there.
I'm with you on that.
And who barely finishes the New York Times by midnight when I fall asleep. And the more I hear of this, the more it sounds to me like this isn't a bad lifestyle in the face of all this stuff. Which isn't to say that I don't recognize that these kinds of things have been happening in politics for a long time, long before we even had the internet. And opinion has been manipulated, and we're all challenged to make sure that we try to get through to it. But I feel a sense of comfort that I don't know what people get all the time. I don't know what the kids get all the time. Don't they play sports anymore? I mean, don't they do other things? Anyway, what can I tell you? But I'm a grandfather of 12, so I just enjoy them, but not on the internet. We've had a slight change for the final part of this program today. I understand that Professor Aptrey wasn't able to be here because of a family situation. And do we have others who are going to be presenting in his place? If so, come on up. Introduce yourself, and let's have a discussion.
Thank you. Tell us who you are. Hello, everyone. I'm Shalom Parikh. I'm a senior systems engineer at ITS at the SUNY system, and I collaborate with Dr. Pradeep Atre, and I'm also a part-time student in his lab. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to attend here today, but I'll be going over some of our work on fake news detection and how we are approaching this problem. By the way, there's going to be some nice weather in Boston. Do we agree with this? Probably not. Couple of thoughts just went through your, brain. Couple of things that, when you see a fake news like this one, you certainly ask yourself, I know this area. This kind of weather never happens in December. So you said, okay, this is fake news. But if somebody who is not familiar with Boston weather and this time of the year would certainly might think that, okay, could be true because it looks authentic. But it was photoshopped yesterday. And let's understand a little bit about fake news. I mean, everybody knows it's, misinformation. And how we look at it is it's anything that is designed to change people's opinion, people's belief on something. It could be in form of news articles, tweets, Facebook post, email, meme that has been a very interesting, form of fake news recently. Multimodal problem can be a combination of text, image, video, a combination of both manipulated or not, or put together in a way to convince people to believe in something. This is another example that I wanted to bring it up about fake news was did a man die from shooting a gun at Hurricane Florence? This story was trending on a couple of social medias, and notice how pay close attention to how it reads out as a question, not a statement. So a lot of the fake news stories are more like an opinion question based versus a statement based. Once we dig deeper into the credibility of the story, we found out a credible source published a story saying this was not true. There was another reason why man died. He had a gun, and there was another issue with it. So a little bit of fact checking can kind of reveal the truthness of such stories. But how do you augment this in an automated manner? So everyday users can actually do this. This has been a challenge. How fake news spread, everybody knows they start from standalone websites, make their way into social media sites. It could also portray them as an email newsletters. Also very small number, but it could be broadcasted on some podcast, radio. Those are audio form of fake news content. Multiple types of data could be on fake news. Could be text, multimedia content. 70% of Facebook users react to the stories when they read a headline and text. Not text, sorry. Headline and an image. So that's how long it takes to trigger somebody to react to a story. Share, comment, like, or so on. There could be embedded content on a fake news story, as well as audio could be embedded into a story to make it more realistic. Then we look at some of the fake news types, and we have categorized them in these categories. Virtually visual-based, mainly focused on content that is more appealing by looking at pictures. It triggers you to do certain things. User-based is usually targeted towards a certain audience. And it leverages bots and fake accounts. So that's one of the popular ones that you see usually. And that is also targeted towards a certain audience that is contemplated between deciding or setting on their opinion. So I think this kind of targeted fake news kind of helps them tip over to the other side than the real side. A post-based usually appears on social media to a text image pair. There's usually a little bit of text involved, and then there's an image that kind of justifies the text. Network-based usually targets certain organization and try to trick them into believing something. Knowledge-based is an interesting one. Usually appears on dark-sided social medias like WhatsApp, where people are sharing a lot of knowledge-based content. There was an interesting one that in 2014, I want to say, a British scientist cloned a dinosaur. This was not true. When we further look into this issue, there was a post by, I believe, Washington Post came out and actually proved not only this did not happen, this actually is not even possible to do it after the DNA has been exposed into the environment for over 1,000 years. So, that was one of the popular one on that usually appear on documents. Style-based, it's about how convincing you want to make it for audience to believe in something. And stance-based kind of leverages the style-based content and also focuses on telling somebody exactly what they want to hear. And a lot of NLP researchers have been focusing on stance-based research for fake news detection. We went over some existing methods. Like I mentioned, a lot of text-based, NLP type of research has happened in this space where they solely focus on the text content of fake news. And then there's image forensic field where you notice a lot of combination of, where I mentioned, a lot of combination of text and image or multimedia content coming into play, where you see a manipulated image and there's a text that kind of certifies certain things which you see, and you start believing something. There was an interesting research at University of Albany, Professor Swen Liu, who recently proposed a fake AI video detection, which his thesis was based on fake videos, if they are generated by AI, they don't blink. So if you're keeping attention to their eye movement, you would notice that they're usually AI generated fake videos. So you will see a lot of our research has been focusing on combination of text-based and as well as integrating image tempering detection, and we can see this being a very useful research to be leveraged into a hybrid approach. There's a video, if you can play for me.
Oh, okay.
No, it's actually right on the slide.
Okay. All right.
I'm very happy to meet you here on iFlyTech's annual announcement. It's a great thing. I'm very happy to meet you here on iFlyTech's annual announcement. It's a great thing to build a better world with artificial intelligence, AI first. 第一次来到中国，我非常高兴。人工智能正在改变世界，科大讯飞真的很棒。And I found iFlyTech HyperBrain， 在讯飞超脑的帮助下，我学会了中文。我觉得我的中文说的比川普好，大家觉得呢？
So this was a small example of how AI can voice over or even face over a lot of the celebrities, and how content can be manipulated and trick you into something, build you into something that is not true. So I think hybrid approach is much necessary. How we're looking at it, we started with 3 basic objectives. We want to be able to detect something in real time, or allow users to organically detect something on their own. Because again, like you just heard, it is hard to argue with somebody who has already made their mind after looking at over a few hundred fake news, let's say. And we must attack the multimodal problem of fake content problem. So this is a bigger picture, just to give you a workflow what we try and do with fake news. A tweet has certain information already available: username, following, number of followers, multimedia content if there is any, URLs if they're trying to tweet something, or static content that's trying to tweet, number of favorites that tweet has received so far, and then number of retweets that tweet has received so far. We're trying to build, we're trying to slice the data and analyze them at a single level, where we're trying to understand the credibility of the person who's tweeting, and so on and so forth. Also, it involves tempering of multimedia content or whatnot, and then we come up with a score, somewhat of a credibility score for the content that you're visualizing. This allows you for an organic way of detecting that if you want to believe in something or not, instead of just saying this is fake or this is real. Okay, we started with the basic hypothesis just to test that, how fake news are hosted on websites that are not ranked higher, because this dates back to, this just goes back to the conversation we were just having about how certain websites are only out there for a few months, they spread their fake news and they disappear. So we noticed a lot of fake news web pages are globally ranked over 100,000 page rank, which is way higher. Just to put it in perspective, CNN has a 11 rank in the global page rank results. Real news now appear, majority of them appear below 10,000, but there are still a certain number that appear over 100,000. Again, we're not too sold on this hypothesis. We're still performing further research to kind of see this data closely. But this was something interesting that we came across. The other scoring mechanism that we are implementing is author's credibility score, and we try to leverage implementation of impact scoring algorithm, which we have developed to kind of understand what are the trending topics and what the fake news is trying to do. Usually the fake news are more of based on the topics that are currently happening. In the later slides, you'll notice what we're trying to do with it and how the user experience can look like. Author's credibility score, a little about it, just 4 major areas that we look at in order to calculate such things. Twitter followers and following. We try to find out how many numbers they are following, how many people are following them. Is the account verified or not? Usually we have noticed they're not verified. We extract the URLs and we try to look for the bylines on those web pages to kind of compare and see and create a big pool of authors of standard content, of course. And then the publication date. Sometimes the content is old, but if the topic has regenerated, you tend to see them reappearing them on social media. And then the third-party hosted content. If the user has shared any content that was not hosted on the particular site that was originally shared, we try to locate such thing and try to our algorithm basically takes into consideration of all of those 4 major variables. How we look at impact scoring, we leverage trending topics and try to compare the current trending fake news stories and try to see if they make any bridge between them. We find similar content on the internet and we try to evaluate by comparing text similarity. Also calculate the relevance of multimedia content, see if that multimedia content actually belongs to the story or not. And then we look at popular and unverified accounts usually spread the fake news, like we were just discussing about followers and following. We look at the ratio between the followers and following. Sometimes you notice there's a few thousand following, and there's only a handful of follow-backs that you notice. And to further strengthen such algorithm, we try to leverage popularity score, and we develop a model to continuously train it and get the score better. So this is what you see sometimes. So let's say consider that is a fake news, which was. And when users see something like this, the first thing they notice, we did some research with some of the members at the lab, and we noticed from their eye tracking was the very first thing they look at is this: the number of tweets, retweets, and what's the stats on that. So if I'm following somebody and my best friend has retweeted already, I feel mostly peer pressure to react to such story because somebody else done it. This looks like this is true. What if you were given some indication of this might not be true by performing certain computation on top of this? For example, we give you author's credibility score, 0.32. It's usually 0 or 1. We have decided which way to go. Is it percentage based or this? But an author's a popularity score, and then you can also see how the content of such tweet is relevant to the current hot topics, and make your own decision. Of course, if there's a multimedia content, we are working on to detect tempered areas of the images to kind of give a better understanding to the users. This basically delays your reaction time. It gives you time to think about things and look at source or two, given this might not be true. So that is the kind of experience we're hoping for. And a little about the gaps in the research towards fake news detection has been a multimodal data set. It's hard to come by. It's has been challenging to kind of create your own. And a multimodal verification method, which we are trying to approach, and we haven't seen a lot of work in the community on such area, on such approach, I should say. Source verification, again, it's very challenging because some sources appear for a certain amount of time and then they disappear after it. And author credibility check has been an interesting one where Twitter, there's an author attached with it, but if you're looking at a static content, how do you find out from the byline, or how many news articles has that person has written, or how do you fact check that? So these are the areas we hope to see some research communities growing into. And we, a summary about what we've been doing, we looked at existing methods, and our approach enables users for organic decision making. Our hypotheses have been tested on BuzzFeed and PolitiFact data sets. Recently, about a week or two ago, an interesting article that came across about Twitter and their commitment to research communities. They recently released about 10 million fake Twitter tweet data, which will be a great help in order to further extend some research. So I hope to continue working on current hypotheses and expand them onto and test them onto much larger data set. And we already have our set of about 5,000 collection of data set that we are hoping to further extend with additional information and make it available for public. And that is it.
Discussion. Question. I realize that you're still in the formative phases of determining your algorithms and type of data that you need to collect. But based on what you've seen so far, to what extent is your hypothesis of how this will work actually detecting fake news? Does it work or not?
It works. So, okay, like you said, we are in very early stages of our research, and we're trying to see if how well it does it. We have yet to kind of form our final decision making. Said, okay, this is fake or not. We are on very early phases on testing pieces by pieces. So, like you just saw, 3 of them are just building blocks of understanding if they are somewhat fake or really fake. So I don't think we are there yet. But what you just saw was just just 2 or 3 beginning implementation of where we want to be.
Have you made any progress with the grandmother problem? The idea of identifying something as fake. Can you then identify some portion of the population that is in danger of believing it, but when given your information, will go, oh, Michelle's a woman. How do you identify the people that will benefit from your information as opposed to just go, you're part of the problem?
That's a very interesting point. So, I suppose we can leverage the author credibility to and reverse engineer it for readers' credibility, and then the results that you show could be triggered that okay, this readers would not believe what we are about to say. So this might require some more additional fact checking in order to convince this user that this is actually fake, don't believe in it. That's something that that we have discussed, but I don't think we have any solution in mind to implement before detecting the fake news or not. But yeah, that is a great point. Yeah.
Anyone else? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning. I want to ask Tom, about yourself? Yeah.
Good morning. Pleasure to be here today. Increasingly, ethics of AI is a part of the daily conversation and also a part of the news reporting. Almost every week we see something about ethics and AI in the news media that is not fake, it's actually true. Privacy decision-making neural networks, social scoring, sentient robots, and infrastructure disruptions bring to the forefront the ethical implications. That's just a few of those ethical implications. AI neural network learning will shatter Moore's law. Governments will never be able to keep up with regulations and the legislation, as Liam mentioned earlier in the presentation. However, the European Union is more focused on AI than the United States from an ethical and legal regulation perspective. From preliminary research, as I mentioned earlier, it appears that British institutions and universities and think tanks are ahead in contemplating AI ethics. What are those implications? What measures can be taken? Certainly, Liam admitted that they're working on it from a legal perspective, but they need to bring up and listen to the academics and the think tanks' own ethics in particular to advise their policies and direction. Well, the Boston Global Forum, the AI Ethics Committee Practices Index, has a concept that we have worked on in the last few days. So it's imperative that the Boston Global Forum be a voice and a force for AI ethics, not just in the United States, but also globally. It must not be just that global realm, but we also need to pay attention to some of the uses that local governments, state and local governments, are looking to use AI for. I've been quite surprised at some of the articles on things, particularly dealing with elections, that they want to use AI for. So think tanks and research institutes are developing ethics and bringing it into the conversation. Almost all AI development is in the corporate world. So how do we bring together the think tanks for ethics, for policy, and bring the corporate world together who is developing the AI to develop a synergy to make our world a better place? And I think that we, at the Boston Global Forum, have that responsibility to try to make that happen. Okay, the statement of purpose for the AI index is the extent to which a government in its AI activities respects human values and contributes to the constructive use of AI. And from this, we developed 4 points that would be Oh, you got it? Okay. Here we go. First one is transparency. Thank you. Promotes openness, transparency, and use of development of AI. Looking at data sets, algorithms. Mark Rotenberg, I believe at our last meeting, had an excellent presentation on the importance of transparency and also building trust in AI. And he is working through EPIC in order to try to push the whole concept of the transparency aspect. Next is regulation. Laws and regulations requiring responsible government, as well as requiring developers to incorporate ethics, minimize that exploitation of individual human rights for political power and gain, and for parsing of biases. As noted earlier, those algorithms are written with someone's values. Whose values are those? How might the internet look different had China invented the internet? And then promotion is the third. Invest in shared human values to promote maximum benefit to people without causing harm. As Cam mentioned, education is quite important, even from the youngest in grade school all the way through. Recently in a DoD meeting with AI, defense, and ethics, there was a focus that the younger person needs education, the operator needs education, and the decision maker needs education in both AI and ethics. That education is not just ethics, but there also needs to be AI education along with that. And the fourth category is implementation. How well do the governments regulate through their laws and ethics? What are the results of the values implementation? Is there congruence between policy and action? In other words, we say one thing and we develop the policy, but are we following through with the appropriate action that reflects the values of these governments and businesses that develop? Methodology. Each of the governments that we will be looking at would be assessed by these four categories, but the standards are yet to be developed. Benchmarks have to be set. This is where participation from you, your organizations, is quite welcome for our committee. We collaborate and work to set a standard for AI ethics. The AI Ethics Index is a living document that will need to change with the technology and increasing risks as it becomes more intrusive and disruptive to humankind. So this is a call to action to further, first of all, to further refine AI Ethics Index. Secondly, to promote ethics education from the young operator to the decision makers, the executives. And third, be a force for promoting ethics and transparency in code. Now fourth, collaborate with institutes, centers, and programs that are seeking an ethical voice. This, I think, is important. Your help is needed in this process, and various centers and institutes can certainly participate. At the United States Naval War College, I'm looking to solicit and use the skills and abilities of our military and federal senior level people to discuss some of the criteria and the benchmarks for AI Ethics Index, especially from our National Security Department, working with Derek Revron. He and I have discussed this in the last 2 or 3 days, where we might want to take this. I'd like to open it up for any discussion, questions, or answers.
When you talk about developing ethics that are shared, with the Defense Department leading this, one of the virtues for many of the systems you talk about is lethality.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in a great part of the world, the idea of lethality is not a virtue, but rather a vice. How do you have that discussion in a way that recognizes universal values?
Well, it definitely would have to have a coming together of minds to try to find that commonality. Lethality is defined now as most anything that is disruptive to the American way of life, to society, that breeds a lack of confidence in the American will to move forward in life. And that seems to be part of the objective of the Russians, is through the fake news, as we have seen, is to confuse things, place doubt in people's minds, and second guess their government and their leaders in order to cause the chaos. The other concern, a colleague who recently testified at the United States Senate on power. He's the CEO of Southern Company, Tom Fanning, and his testimony was available publicly. And his concern is the risk to national security if there is a major power outage. These are things that is part of the definition of lethality. Most people think of it in previous technology terms of, destroying life. in that sense, and dropping bombs. But lethality has changed to include all the disruptive technologies, AI, Euro, Nano, IO, information, and on it goes. So in this asymmetrical world, most anything that can be weaponized is now in that definition of lethality. So it makes it much more complex. It's like trying to sort out the fake news, as Cam had mentioned earlier. I don't know if that answers your question because it's a complex question, but it's will take efforts. I think we also have to look at it from the perspective that the adversaries need to feel that there is a threat to them. We've always worked on the just war tradition to be able to, what is our reason for entering the conflict? Do we have justification? And various, about 14 criteria there that we look at. But all of that has changed because technology challenges those values that the Western world has had in order to preserve life and to minimize conflict wherever possible from the ethical just war tradition. So now we have all these different technologies that are being weaponized. AI is probably the most lethal technology to our democracy. And so it's as complex as trying to figure out the fake news. But we have to do something as an organization in developing an AI index and developing the context in which people can have dialogue, and other actors and players need to understand that they may be at risk too. Now, some of the biggest problems that we have is the independent or the non-state actor. How do you deal with them? And that's a complex question that we're all dealing with. We're working on it. That's the best I can say at this point in time. And being a part of this group, the War College, is part of that initiative. Any other thoughts or questions?
Yeah, so this is an offshoot of my question to Liam as well. Around just, you mentioned AI very, very generically, right? So the spectrum goes from like artificial narrow intelligence to artificial general intelligence, where researchers are working on recreating the mind. But today we see applications being kind of like very advanced software, right? From RPA technologies, etc. How are academics getting involved in understanding the technologies we're dealing with today, and then also identifying where the technology spectrum is going in, say, 10 years or 15 years or 20 years? How is that collaboration happening from an information institute?
Sure. I'd like to point out Matthias Schutz. You still here? Matthias was here earlier. Matthias came to the War College and spoke, and he brought a lot of information from his research and work. We have the Ethics of Emerging Military Technology Graduate Certificate Program at the War College. The objective for our candidates in the program is to select an area of technology, where it may be AI or not, but most of them right now are looking at AI, and to look at a future ethical issue, lethality or some other nefarious use where it's been weaponized, or deception, and be able to determine what ethical issues might arise and how we might address those. So we have a whole institute of future warfare, and are gearing our ethics education and research towards that. We're reaching out to other institutions and organizations and having those experts to be advisors to our senior military and federal level executives in their research work. I know the Joint AI Center, General Shanahan, is quite interested in us doing work for them. Also, we've had the director of DARPA, Steve Walker, has discussed us doing research on their ethical projects. That's quite important. And the USARIM, which is the Army's Research Center at just west of here, is wanting us to look at their human enhancement type of technologies as well. So we're only in our third year, just started our third year. And We're bringing in experts, Georgia Tech, Georgetown University, and other areas to collaborate and to discuss some of the emerging issues. Yes, ma'am.
How are you collaborating? Is that
Yeah, right now, we're in talks with DARPA and with USAIEM. Those are the only two. We've had some corporations that have asked for some participation, but we have to go through the legalities of that. When you deal with the government, there's always huge bureaucracy to deal with. But we are looking to move forward. We've had some companies ask if they could come and take the Ethics and Emerging Military Technology graduate certificate, which we can't allow that. So first of all, we just have a small bandwidth there. And so if we can increase the bandwidth to support that, then we would be able to. We have 17 candidates at this point. Any other thoughts or questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. One final brief presentation. Kelly Blanton is only the founder of AI World, executive editor of AI Trends, organizer of major conference and part of that. He's got a board announcement about what's coming up. Sure. Well, so busy this morning. Thank you. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes. I just wanted to first thank Governor Dukakis and Tuan for hosting. I introduced Governor Dukakis as the plenary speaker on Tuesday morning at AI World last week. AI World, if you don't know, is was on our third year, so we're entering our fourth year. And I think the largest AI enterprise commercial trade show in the United States right now. And earlier this year, Tuan gave me a call, and I was privileged enough to meet with the governor several times. And he invited me to help and coordinate, and we invited the governor and the Dukakis Global Forum to create a strategic alliance together. Our company, Cambridge Innovation Institute, reaches over 1 million people a year, mostly publishing in events. John is our editor for AI Trends. And in addition to the commercial worldwide activity with AI, what we've seen, particularly this year and actually last week, I don't know how many days Governor Dukakis was there, but I know Tuan was in the front row of the keynotes every morning. And ethics, security, privacy have just exploded for all the obvious reasons. The first couple of years, I've been in AI for 20, 25 years. It's always been a backdrop, but there hasn't been any type of, I would say, consolidated or major concerns until recently. And some of the things that we talked about earlier about the GDPR and what Liam was talking about, and we've met many people here. Tom is working on this, Dave Weinberger here at Harvard, and many others. So one of the clear messages from the event last week was a call to action by everybody, really asking step up and try to get a conference or people together to coordinate the various silos of ethics definitions from the War College, from what Tom was working on, to what the UK is. We just had a call with Tom, Lord Clement Jones, from who I think works with Liam in the UK. He initiated the AI ethics parliament efforts in the UK government. He wrote a piece. There's been some, papers written and some attention by the US government this year, not that much. And there's efforts going on at Stanford. There's efforts going on by every commercial company to create ethics in the way they create software, particularly game manufacturers. Danny Lang, who is one of the world experts in AI. He headed up AI at Microsoft, at Amazon, at Uber,
And also now he's at Unity Technologies, which is the largest game software company. So this guy's an expert. His keynote last week basically said that he has now created a whole ethics effort internally at Unity for the kids, to help prevent these kids from getting exploited by games. So this is just a massive problem, challenge. So really the only reason I'm here, other than to thank Boston Global Forum and for inviting me to participate in these, these discussions. What we've decided to do is we are going to have an event in Washington, D.C., June 24th to the 26th. 2/3 of it will be an AI event for the government. The government faces a lot of different types of challenges with regards to deploying AI, much less ethics, as Tom knows, from procurement to it takes forever to work with the government. Only some companies can, so it's a different marketplace than the commercial market. But the first day, we're going to convene an event with and led by Governor Dukakis and Tuan. I hope, Tom, we talked last time, hopefully you'll be there. Perhaps Liam will be there, and we welcome, we're in a process for call for papers, and we have an advisory board of a half a dozen people so far, from commercial, from government, from SRI and Park and other companies that really do a lot of business with the government. And we welcome you to participate. There's a lot of activities here at Harvard and MIT, and we hope that you'll help us bring these groups together, from the Googles to Facebooks to Stanford and many other reputable organizations doing these ethics. And if we can consolidate and accelerate this into the marketplace, I think it'd be better for everybody. So thank you.
Thanks, Elliot, very much. It's an interesting meeting and convening of a lot of people there. Obviously, there's an enormous amount of interest here. Great need for wisdom and good thought, research, and so on. I hope you've enjoyed this morning as much as I have. And it's pretty clear that we have a lot of work to do for us. But this is one among many areas that can be addressed. So it is true, Kitty and I will drag ourselves out of New England the day after Christmas. Right. We'll be teaching at UCLA for the winter quarter, but we'll be back in early April, and we'll be reconvening on the 25th of April here. Yeah. Our forum, and getting ready for Elliot's event. And thanks, obviously, again to Swan and the staff for everything they've done to do all the things with our presentations. If you find your way out to Los Angeles during the winter, please check in. I'll give you a tour of the campus. Then you go back not much. But I'll be back and we'll be reconvening in April. I hope you'll put that date down. And thanks to everybody and happy holidays. And let's move ahead together. Thank you.
Thank you.